The best-selling VCS game of all time makes its controversial debut as we look at the tale of Atari's Pac-Man. There are a handful of games that truly define the VCS platform. 1977's Combat and Video Olympics provided solid mission statements that this machine would take the arcade hits of the day and make top-notch versions available at home. The immensely successful Space Invaders home conversion put the platform on the map in 1980, turning it from a modest success in a small-scale home video game market into a world-beating success story, in turn exploding the entire home video game industry into a force to be reckoned with. Other console exclusives like Adventure and third-party releases like Kaboom showed off what the machine was capable of with unique game concepts. And today we have Pac-Man, far and away the most hotly anticipated and best-selling VCS game ever produced, and one with a certain reputation today. We can rip the bandage off early here. The Atari VCS version of Pac-Man only resembles the coin-op original in the broad strokes. At best, it was considered merely fine in its day, and its stock has only fallen in the years since. But why was this game such a massive hit? And why did it miss the mark? For that, we have to take a step back to the origins of Pac-Mania, Namco's initially unassuming 1980s smash arcade game, Pac-Man. Credit where it's due first up. A fair bit of this comes from historian Ethan Johnson and the research he put into the Pac-Man Birth of an Icon book by Tim Lapatino and Arjan Terpstra that he consulted on, with that book being a singularly excellent source on the history of the game and character. If you're unfamiliar with the original 1980 coin-op game, Pac-Man puts players in the shoes of a little yellow circle with a mouth named Pac-Man, who must wander around a maze eating all the dots while avoiding ghosts that are chasing after him. The only time the ghosts are vulnerable is when Pac-Man eats one of 4 large dots in the corner, known as power pellets, at which point they change color for a few seconds and allow you to get bonus points by eating them too. Bonus items pop up every so often in the center of the screen, and every few stages there's a little cinematic that'll play to reward your skills. Pac-Man was not designer Toru Iwatani's first video game though. That goes to Namco's summer 1978 release GB, a paddle pinball game that features the same ball and paddle mechanics as Atari's hit Breakout in a playfield reminiscent of a pinball table. Unfortunately for Namco, Space Invaders debuted that summer and quickly overtook Breakout and Breakout-style clones as the big games in the gaming space. Iwatani designed 2 follow-ups, Bombi and Cutie Q, but it became clear that this particular game design was no longer in the zeitgeist, and that GB in particular was too difficult for most people to pick up. And so, in 1979, Iwatani started working on a maze chase game. Pac-Man is not the first maze chase game to see popularity in Japan. Sega Gremlin's coin-op title Head-On, published in April 1979, was a major success in the region. Head-On features the player trying to collect all the dots in a concentric maze while a computer-controlled car tries to ram into them. The players can't change direction, but they can shift into different lanes and change speed to try and avoid the computer. Head-On was popular enough to be cloned both in the coin-op space and at home, including Atari's own Dodge'em. And while no one at Namco has ever confirmed it, including Iwatani, it's hard to imagine that it was not an influence on what would become Pac-Man. Certainly the folks at Sega Gremlin thought so. Frank Fogelman, the head of Gremlin, mentions in Ken Horowitz's book The Sega Arcade Revolution that when Gremlin was looking for a buyer, which ended up being Sega, they had met with Namco's president Masaya Nakamura. While a deal never ended up being struck, Fogelman said Nakamura was particularly interested in Head-On during their visit, playing the in-development version well into the evening. Iwatani's telling of the core idea of Pac-Man, eating food in a maze, doesn't feature Nakamura at all, but rather him throwing ideas around with a few of his developer co-workers for actions that could involve food. We do know a few other influences led to the creation of Pac-Man. The common story goes that Iwatani was inspired by a pizza missing a slice. In the 1986 book Programmers at Work, Iwatani said this was only half true. Rather, Pac-Man is based off the Japanese kanji for mouth, kuchi, which is square. He opted to round off the corners, resulting in the circular shape that has become iconic. The design may have also been influenced by 1970s eating toys such as Mr. Mouth, but there's no clear connection there either. As for the ghosts, Iwatani stated in the Birth of an Icon book that the designs were influenced by the Japanese manga series Obake no Kyutaro, which came out when he was a schoolboy. There, he said, ghosts are cutesy and friendly, and he wanted to ensure that the ghosts in Pac-Man were cute rather than scary. Rather than be absolutely relentless, Iwatani's team opted to design the ghosts to go after the player in waves of attack and retreat, basing their unique movements off the player's own actions thanks to an algorithm designed by the game's programmer, Shigeo Funaki. This allowed for what became known as pattern play, or as long as the player repeated the same movements, the ghosts would always behave the same, allowing those who had memorized patterns to always clear a maze without being hit by a ghost. After multiple iterative passes that saw some ideas stick around, such as the tunnels to warp to the opposite ends of the maze, or the central ghost nest, and some that didn't make it, such as Pac-Man being able to shoot projectiles, the game was beginning to resemble what we all know and recognize today as Pac-Man. The game saw a location test on May 22, 1980, with a full release that August in Japanese coin-op locations. According to research by historian Keith Smith, the location test was done in a lounge area near a movie theater in Shibuya, where it proved most popular with women and slightly less popular with men. Pac-Man took about a month and a half for unit sales to begin to pick up dramatically, to the point where Namco struggled to source parts, according to interviews mentioned in the Birth of an Icon book. By all reports, Smith wrote in his unpublished book, All in a Color for a Quarter, Pac-Man was moderately popular to begin with, which made it come across as an unassuming title for American companies to license out when Namco began shopping it around. Namco felt that another maze chase game, Rally X, was the big game out of that, Pac-Man, King and Balloon, and Tank Battalion. And scouts from Midway, Atari, and Game Plan all considered Pac-Man interesting, but likely too cute for the American market. In the end, Midway ended up licensing Rally X and Pac-Man for Western release, changing its name from the Japanese Puck-Man to Pac-Man, and showcased it in October during the Amusement and Music Operators of America show in Chicago. Even there, Pac-Man's reaction was rather low-key, with games such as Battlezone, Berserk, and Defender stealing its thunder. Playmeter wrote that Pac-Man was cute and had more depth than first appears, but that the sound effects were a drawback that could get annoying over time. Under the licensing agreement, Bally Midway and Namco would split the profits 50-50, a division that wound up putting Namco in a very good position. Domestically, Namco was able to move about 15,000 Pac-Man cabinets, with another few thousand exported to other countries in Europe and Asia. Strong numbers for the time, but below the 30,000 that the company was trying to manufacture, and enough to mark Pac-Man as only a reasonable success in its home territory. Pac-Man's success in the US, on the other hand, cannot be overstated. The reaction from players was very robust once units started hitting American locations in December. By February, it had been dubbed a hit game by distributors, with Midway selling through its initial 5,000 unit production run, as the game proved to be a massive success. Pac-Man's simplicity, visual appeal, and cutesy theme all came together to bring a new peak to the then ballooning fad of coin-op video games. Pac-Man, alongside other monster hits like Asteroids, helped bring arcade games into a variety of venues, from liquor stores and grocery markets to restaurants and dentists' offices. Midway was considered a good partner for Japanese companies since it had robust manufacturing and distribution networks, but Pac-Man strained even that. In September 1981, Bally Midway announced that they'd sold 60,000 of the arcade units so far, and expected to hit 100,000 by the end of the production run, smashing records set by Space Invaders and Asteroids. Historian Keith Smith's research suggests ultimately around 96,000 units were produced by the company, very close to those expectations. Midway looked for new avenues to push Pac-Man. According to product manager Bill Adams, Midway's co-founder Henry Ross was Pac-Man nuts, and encouraged the company to do more with the license. This led to Pac-Man's inclusion in the Kickman coin-op game, and several Pac-Man sequels published by Midway under license from Namco, such as Pac-Man Plus, Ms. Pac-Man, Junior Pac-Man, and Baby Pac-Man. Namco, meanwhile, produced a couple more Pac-Man sequels of its own in this era, notably Super Pac-Man, also licensed to Midway, but due to the original game never exploding in Japan like it did in the US, the appetite doesn't appear to have been there on the Namco side to really exploit Pac-Man as heavily as Midway would elsewhere. And exploit Midway did. Its licensing agreement with Namco allowed it to sub-license out a wide array of Pac-Man merchandise to combat bootlegging, from coin-op games to everything else, as long as Namco received its customary 50-50 royalty split. Midway licensed out Pac-Man themed clothing, board games, a TV show, plush toys, and of course the Pac-Man Fever music album by Buckner and Garcia. This was the height of Pac-Mania, and in a lot of ways, the height of the video game arcade machine space in the US. And in April 1981, Atari secured a license directly from Namco to produce home computer and console versions of the game, with both companies making public announcements as such in the fall. This agreement also included the home rights to Namco's Galaxian, which Atari started releasing home versions of later in 1982, and it made Namco an official distributor of Atari's coin-op products in Japan once again. Atari did not disclose how much it paid for those Pac-Man home rights, but by October had already committed $1.5 million to promoting and advertising their home version, and had already booked more than 1 million orders for the VCS cartridge by the end of November. Print ads started running after Christmas that proclaimed Atari was bringing Pac-Man home early in 1982. To defend this prime market and these investments, Atari proved to be extremely litigious prior to their own games coming out, when similar gobble games started emerging elsewhere. Most notably, we have Sierra Online's computer games Gobbler and Jawbreaker, both of which were very clearly copying Pac-Man as close as they could reasonably get. Gobbler was more or less a straight clone of Pac-Man, and a successful one. Sierra sold approximately 1,000 copies a month while it was on the market, which were strong sales for the niche of Apple II games. Jawbreaker featured some changed graphical elements and a revised maze, but was otherwise quite similar to Pac-Man, and was sold on the Atari 8-bit computer line. Both it and the arcade original won Archie Awards in 1982. Atari, joined by Midway, eventually sued, though ultimately the matter was settled out of court after their infringement claims were thrown out. Jawbreaker did eventually make it to the VCS, albeit with significant changes. The courts were slightly less kind to another console maze chase game, Magnavox's Casey Munchkin. According to court documents and several interviews that developer Ed Averitt has done in the years since, Magnavox's North American head of video game development, Mike Staup, requested Averitt write a Pac-Man-style game after the two men had seen the game in action at an airport. Averitt was not a Magnavox employee, but rather an independent contractor who had by that point written about 21 games for the Odyssey II hardware, as parent company North American Philips didn't want to delve too deeply into the video game market in the console's first few years. Magnavox pursued getting the official Pac-Man license but was told it was unavailable, so Averitt further tweaked his in-development version to ensure it was unique enough to avoid legal challenges. Averitt has said that the marketing folks at Magnavox asked him to tweak it further in some ways to make it closer to Pac-Man, while changing other details such as the colors to continue to differentiate it. Casey Munchkin debuted in November 1981, months before Atari's own home versions of Pac-Man started coming along, and was a major success for the company, becoming its fastest-selling Odyssey II title and the first real killer app for the machine. At the end of 1981, Magnavox announced that Casey Munchkin had sold more copies in its short time on the market than the company had sold of all its Odyssey II cartridges in 1980. Naturally, this drew Atari's ire, and they took Magnavox to court over the game, claiming it violated their copyright and seeking damages and the removal of the game from store shelves. Taking a step back, Casey Munchkin is clearly not the same game as Pac-Man. Expert witness and games journalist Bill Kunkel noted as much in his own musings on the topic from 2003. The number of dots on the screen are reduced to about a dozen, and the dots move around the maze, speeding up as the player eats them. The ghost equivalent's number 3, and while there are still power pellets, they too drift around the maze. Finally, the game features multiple maze designs, including invisible ones, and the ability to design, albeit not save, your own. It's a maze chase gobble game like Pac-Man, but it's certainly not Pac-Man. The district court in Chicago ruled in favor of Magnavox, refusing to block sales of the game and ruling that Atari was unlikely to succeed on the merits, as no code, algorithms, or anything else of the like had been copied. This victory caused Philips to recognize that there was real money to be made investing in video games, and began to staff up the Odyssey II team with in-house developers and more marketing dollars. Atari appealed the ruling to the Seventh Circuit Court, which put the injunction blocking sales of Casey Munchkin into effect in March 1982. Atari had shifted tactics to arguing that the look and feel of the two games was why it was infringing, outmaneuvering Magnavox's attorneys. The court did not actually rule that Casey Munchkin infringed on Atari's copyright, but Atari got the outcome it wanted. Magnavox could no longer sell new copies of Casey Munchkin in the US, though stores that still had copies in stock could continue to sell through them. Magnavox unsuccessfully appealed to the US Supreme Court to try and get the injunction lifted, and the actual court case over copyright returned to the district court, but never actually was resolved due to the video game market essentially imploding. Averitt would go on to write a sequel, Casey's Crazy Chase, which is further differentiated from Pac-Man by the presence of the Dratapillar as the object to eat instead of dots. And given how well Casey Munchkin itself sold, the game is not particularly hard to find. And this brings us to the VCS home game itself. If you'll recall from the various arcade conversions we've seen in this series, rarely do the home versions match up to the arcade originals 1-to-1. Rather, each one involves the developer reflecting on what the most important aspects are of the coin-op title, and implementing those to the best they can within the hardware constraints they're working under. With mid-1970s games ported to the VCS, you could get a pretty good approximation in play, if not visually. Look at David Crane's Canyon Bomber, Brad Stewart's Breakout, or Ed Riddle's Indy 500 as examples. Later games required a lot more compromises, however. Space Invaders is generally considered a great port, but it is missing quite a few aspects of the arcade original, such as the number of invaders and the bunkers, and the shot-counting aspect that gaining high scores on the arcade version relies on. Missile Command looks great, but it's missing airplane. It's missiles that split in midair and two of the bases. Asteroids replaces the sharp vectors of the arcade game with colorful blobs that don't move quite as dynamically as they do in the cart's big sibling. Quite a few of these make up the gap by adding in varying game modes and options, but overall this was the expectation on the part of designers and players. Don't expect perfection, but expect something that kind of plays like the game you're dropping quarters into. And indeed, this was the expectation that developer Tod Frye set for himself. Pac-Man was the first time Frye had attempted making a game for the VCS hardware, having previously worked on Atari's unreleased Breakout handheld and the reasonably solid Atari computer conversion of Asteroids. In an interview with Marty Goldberg and Kurt Vendel, Frye explained that he took the game on as Atari had a bulletin board of available projects, and the other newest game, Defender, had already been claimed by fellow dev Bob Polero. Contrary to internet myth-making, Frye said that he had a regular development time frame to work on the game, and given that his boss, Dennis Coble, had him on probation, he knew he had to get Pac-Man working on the VCS properly and on time. From May 1981 through September, Frye put together the game we know today and made the design choices that seem odd in hindsight, but made sense to him at the time. Frye didn't like the minimalistic color scheme used in the arcade, and so, inspired by Stewart's Asteroids home port and Rick Moore's Space Invaders conversion, decided to change the colors used to make the game more visually interesting in his eyes. Frye had problems implementing the maze, so he adjusted the warp tunnels to the top and bottom of the screen while keeping the other core elements, such as the ghost house in the center, the bonus items appearing underneath it, and the power pellets in the corners. Much as with Asteroids and Missile Command, Frye got around the VCS's sprite limitations by flickering the ghost graphics so that they'd be drawn on alternating frames, an effect that makes them more, ghostly on a CRT, but can make it difficult to see when they're vulnerable after eating a power pellet. Crucially, Frye recognized that the ghosts in the arcade game moved on an algorithm based on how the player moves, and so he wanted to ensure that the home version similarly had pattern play like its arcade predecessor. And indeed, the ghosts here will always make the same moves based on what the player does, so you can develop untouchable patterns for this home version just as you could the arcade. There was one more feature that Frye felt he absolutely needed to include, and which probably hurt the final game more than any other decision, and that was making VCS Pac-Man 2-player. Frye felt that because the arcade game had a 2-player option, it was necessary to include this in the home game. He also just thought it was fun to have 2 people playing the game at once. But keeping track of 2 players' game states means using up a lot of the VCS's very paltry memory, limiting its availability to the other parts of the program. Towards the end of the game's development cycle, Frye's bosses approached him about potentially revising Pac-Man to use the larger 8K cartridge, which had been newly utilized to accommodate the Asteroids home port, but Frye felt that by that point the bigger issue was not cartridge space but memory. As such, moving his code to the 8K cartridge space might have reduced some of the ghost flicker, but it would have been very tricky to code, and ultimately he tossed out the idea as being too difficult at that stage in development to implement. Tellingly, the other 2 Pac-Man games on the VCS, Ms. Pac-Man and Junior Pac-Man, are single-player affairs using larger cartridge sizes from the jump, so the timing of Pac-Man's creation and that design choice likely played the biggest factors into why the game turned out as it did. Booting up this VCS Pac-Man, the differences are glaringly obvious. The ghosts don't really have their own personalities or really anything to differentiate them. They're all the same color, and they all sort of lazily try to box in the player. The horizontal edges of the maze get particularly weird and twisty, with the central region being a bit plainer to maneuver through. The core elements are all still here, such as the bonus item and the power pellets, and each ghost eaten per pellet increases in value. The score values aren't the same here as they are in the arcade. The fourth ghost, for example, will only net you 160 points instead of 1600, and the bonus item is only ever worth 100 points. Clearing a maze takes you straight to another round with an extra life, and slightly faster ghosts in Pac-Man. The various game options adjust how fast Pac-Man and the ghosts move, and the difficulty switches will adjust how long bonus items appear on screen and how long the power pellets last. The standard children's mode is here once again, providing a painfully slow Pac-Man and ghosts to ensure the youngest players have a fair challenge. While the core Pac-Man experience isn't quite here, these options do allow you to get a pretty good challenge out of this cartridge to balance out the fact that it feeds you extra lives like candy. It's not Pac-Man as an arcade rat would know it, but it's a perfectly fine maze game in its own right. The problem ultimately may be that Frye strayed a bit too far from what people were expecting from a Pac-Man home conversion with his color choices and design decisions, a lesson seen a couple years earlier with Rob Fulop's Atari 8-bit Space Invaders port, which was more of a clone than a conversion, but reiterated here on a much grander scale. Given how hot Pac-Man was running in coin-op spaces, Atari knew Pac-Man was going to sell extremely well on the VCS. The cartridge was subject to a massive advertising campaign early in 1982, and Atari estimated selling 7 million copies in 1982. And to be clear, the myth that Atari produced more copies of this game than there were VCS units is not actually true. For reference, the best-selling VCS game by this point was Space Invaders. Based on internal Atari record-keeping, they'd sold a bit more than 4.2 million copies of that by the end of 1981. So to say that expectations were high for Pac-Man may be an understatement. Atari expected this to sell like hotcakes, and they were not wrong. Based on many, many examples of local newspaper reporting and early editions of the Video Takeout newsletter, Pac-Man flew off shelves, and it was nigh impossible to keep any stock for more than a couple of days. Atari promoted April 3rd as Pac-Man Day, with events in 26 cities across the US, and local retailers promoted Pac-Man merchandise and tournaments with the VCS version to get people in the door throughout the spring. Atari's own internal sales tracking indicates the company sold 7.2 million copies of Pac-Man through 1982, right in line with expectations, and less than the total number of VCS units in homes. According to the book They Create Worlds, Atari had produced and sold more than 5.1 million VCS units by the end of 1981, with another 12 million sold over the course of 1982. That said, Retail Trade Merchandising ran an article in October where a shop owner in Knoxville reported that while Pac-Man was still selling pretty much one-to-one with VCS units, after the initial surge the demand wasn't quite there as consumers who really wanted the game had gotten their copies. He also added that Pac-Man fever in general seemed to have leveled off not long after, with other Pac-Man merchandise sales falling off as well. Billboard reported in January 1983 that Pac-Man had indeed seen a sales surge for the Christmas season, mainly to new VCS owners. Electronics Industry Trade Weekly Television Digest also reported in December that Pac-Man sales flattened out after the introductory surge, so it's likely that the bulk of that 7.2 million came within the first few months of the game's release. But a decent number were still moving late in the year. I will also note that this predates any formal return policy by Atari, so even if people weren't enthused about Pac-Man, the game was not being returned in any real numbers. The retail reception was hot. The critical reception, more mixed. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz, the two major pillars of video game reviewing at the time, were thoroughly unimpressed, writing in the June 1982 edition of Video that those who, quote, can't evaluate Pac-Man through lovers' eyes, unquote, were likely going to be disappointed. They list off its shortcomings, that it lacks the cute bells and whistles of the arcade original, or any attempt to mimic the sound cues of the Namco cabinet, nor the visual cues of which direction the ghosts are going based on their eye lines. On the flip side, they recognize that those just looking for a maze chase game in the vein of Pac-Man would likely be satisfied, and praise the artistry of Pac-Man himself. They did not mince words in the Electronic Games Review in the June 1982 edition either, writing that it neither looks nor sounds like the original, devoid of the charm of the arcade machine, but at least, they add, there is now a gobble game on the VCS. Others had their own takes that were a little less harsh. Kim Humphreys of the News Tribune out of Fort Pierce, Florida, noted in an article that home games frequently look worse than their arcade counterparts, but that while Pac-Man junkies may be appalled by the VCS game's visuals, it played similarly enough that they could forget about it. Craig Kuby wrote in the Winner's Book of Video Games that while the game is different from the arcade version, the inclusion of pattern-based play meant that Pac-Man aficionados could enjoy developing strategies for this home conversion without needing to spend any quarters. Peter Boyer, writing for the Los Angeles Times, indicates that the general consensus is that Pac-Man for the VCS was the biggest disappointment since Ford's Etzel car due to its array of differences, though noted that given that the other Atari home conversions also fall short of lofty expectations, that this isn't a particularly strong argument to make against those that have never really stepped foot in an arcade, at the time more the domain of teenagers than smaller children. In late December, as Atari started its press run before the Winter Consumer Electronics Show amidst a disappointing earnings report, Warner CEO Manny Gerard mentioned that he was somewhat less than thrilled by some of the coin-op conversions coming out of Atari, an oblique reference, most likely, to the VCS version of Pac-Man. So the VCS version's reception was mixed, to say the least, but Atari did take full advantage of its home rights by porting Pac-Man to a slew of home computers, and even a few other consoles. The Atari 8-bit version, released in April, hewed much more closely to the arcade original. This was developed by Joe Hellison for the developer Rocklin, Hellison having come to Rocklin's attention after developing a Space Invaders clone, Deluxe Invaders, and selling it to them. According to an interview with Kay Savitz, either Atari or Rocklin had a Pac-Man arcade cabinet delivered to his apartment, allowing him plenty of time to learn the rules for the ghost's behavior, and he read about the patterns used by the ghosts to hunt for Pac-Man himself, and was able to use that insight to craft his conversion over the course of about 6 months. The program uses the computer's custom character set function to mix and match colors to better imitate the arcade game and make the maze background. Atari didn't pay Rocklin all that much for the game, only $25,000 according to Savitz, but it was a prestige project for Hellison and Rocklin that led to the company getting some additional Atari projects down the line. Hellison noted that he didn't even get paid half of that for his work on the cartridge, and wondered if part of the budget went towards the Pac-Man cabinet they provided him. This version was the basis for a 5200 conversion released later that year, which had some bug fixes and additions such as the intermissions and new sound effects, thanks to developer James Andreasen. Atari in turn ended up making Pac-Man the Pac-In title for the 5200 in 1983 as well, though the system's mushy joysticks can make maneuvering through the maze more difficult than it should be. In late 1983, Atari published a version for the Intellivision that does a great job of carrying the play and the style of the arcade original to the platform. Even the odd Intellivision controller doesn't work against it very much. The developer Mike Winans worked at Mattel as a game developer and notably wrote the excellent Intellivision conversion of Lock 'n' Chase, a maze chase game in the vein of Pac-Man. After Atari poached Winans and a few other developers from Mattel into APH for their Atari Soft initiative, he was the natural choice to work on this version of Pac-Man. According to Winans' interview with the Intellivisionaries podcast, the head of the Intellivision division at Atari, former Intellivision dev Russ Haft, worked with another hire, Mark Kennedy, to build their own on-cartridge OS, dubbed the MCP, to avoid any legal issues with Mattel, and simultaneously set their new staff to work on a variety of arcade conversions that Atari held the license to. While not an ideal development environment, the crew was under a very tight timetable to get Atari's initial Intellivision offerings out in time for the 1983 holiday season. Known as the three golden titles for Atari of Centipede, Defender, and Pac-Man, they were all home conversions of major coin-op titles at the time. In between development of the MCP, Haft worked on the sound design for Pac-Man, while Eric Wells wrote the graphics, all while Winans developed the game itself. Winans said that Pac-Man was very well understood by the point he started working on his version, from the patterns and ghost mechanics to graphical elements and bonus items. He said that Kennedy had helped him put together a randomness element to the ghost's movements to prevent pattern play, but that option was shut down by Atari management, who insisted that patterns be repeatable in the Intellivision version, which he found tricky to implement properly. Winans had time to work on fine-tuning the speed in the ghosts, but the production time was too tight to really tweak it further or add anything unique to the game. Meanwhile, Mattel went after Atari and the developers with a lawsuit to try and stop them from releasing those games before Christmas. This didn't work out for Mattel, as the trio of games made it out that December. The lawsuit was dismissed, and the following January, Mattel Electronics closed its doors. Atari continued selling its games for a while into 1984 before selling its old stock and the game programs themselves to INTV, which formed from former Mattel staff to continue supporting the Intellivision. INTV ended up licensing Pac-Man itself and producing additional copies of Atari's game in the late 80s due to its popularity. A ColecoVision port, which went unreleased due to the home console market's meltdown and Atari's own woes, was nearly completed, and the file has been floating around online since the late 90s. This port is also incredibly faithful. You can find solid, officially licensed ports published by Atari on a slew of home computers, such as the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, and the Apple II, where Atari took an existing unlicensed clone, Taxman, and had it republished with the Pac-Man branding. Tod Frye may have produced a compromised VCS version due to the combination of design choices and hardware limitations, but certainly Atari and its developers were more than happy to take advantage of more capable hardware to produce as accurate a home version as they could elsewhere. And those were just the licensed conversions. The Bally Professional Arcade hosted 2 different Pac-Man clones, one of which was in development for a 1982 release by Astrocade. This version was written by Midway developer Bill Adams, known for coin-op games like Satan's Hollow and Tron, and is remarkably accurate to the original game in terms of maze layout, sound effects, graphics, and even ghost behavior. Adams said at the Southern Fried Game Room Expo in 2016 that Dave Nutting Associates, a Skunkworks game development division of Bally Midway by this point, had been working on it, and had Adams write the game as a favor to him. Adams finished the game only for them to discover Namco had sold the home license to Atari, which ended up putting Adams out about $11 million in an anticipated royalty split. Initially advertised for 1982 as Munchie, the game never made its way out officially. That said, a copy made its way into enthusiast hands and was promptly copied and sold through the Arcadian newsletter and in independent retail stores like ABC Hobbycraft in Indiana, under a few different names. Interestingly, Adams added that the code he wrote for it was reused for the Baby Pac-Man hybrid pinball video game machine, as the professional arcade hardware was by design quite similar to Midway's arcade hardware at the time. He was paid for his code tables, and the DNA staff modified the patterns and used it to finish the game. The other, Maze Man, has some key differences in graphics and maze design, but otherwise plays very similar to Pac-Man, at the expense of having no sound. The author of this game has remained anonymous to avoid any legal issues and has never come forward. In recent years, unlicensed homebrew developers have brought Pac-Man to platforms that it never appeared on back in the day, such as the RCA Studio 2, the ColecoVision, the Atari 7800, and even the Fairchild Channel F. As for the VCS version of Pac-Man, the game stuck around for practically the rest of the VCS's life as a solid seller. Atari sold another 684,569 copies in 1983, a smaller number likely from the combined factor of the bottom falling out of VCS game prices and Atari's decision to begin packing the game alongside Combat for new VCS units sold that year. Sales were up and down in the platform's twilight years, peaking in 1989 with 61,685 copies sold. From 1986 to 1990, the game sold about 123,000 units. These are well below what its sequels, Junior Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, were selling, but were still substantial for an older VCS title. With all years we have data for, Pac-Man ended up selling through approximately 8 million copies, an absolutely mind-boggling number that wouldn't be matched until the NES era, with games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Tetris. Tod Frye certainly did well off the royalties for the game, becoming a millionaire almost overnight. Frye claimed to Goldberg and Vendel that Pac-Man may have been a factor in Atari offering royalty shares to its developers to prevent them from abandoning ship for third parties like Activision and Imagic, as he himself had been planning to leave the company and had said as much to his bosses before receiving that offer. Pac-Man is looked at nowadays as the harbinger of the video game market crash in the US, but that's kind of an unfair argument. The game is not a fantastic home conversion, and many copies were produced, but those copies were selling, at least early on, and once it became a pack-in title, everyone buying a VCS in 1983 was getting it too. Gerard remarked in his December 1982 comments for CES that Pac-Man's release may have been mistimed, as third-party arcade ports such as Frogger and Donkey Kong were selling very strongly, and Atari had only one arcade port released in the latter half of the year, August's Berserk. Additionally, the company faced increased competition from other publishers from the middle of the year onward, a time that Pac-Man could have dominated had that initial surge taken place later in the year. That said, Atari's major issue stemmed from poor product tracking to distributors and retailers, ordering far more games than there were demand for. Neither of which seemed to necessarily have been an issue for Pac-Man, at least through the spring and summer. Pac-Man may not be an amazing game, but to call it the death of an industry is a bit much. As for Frye, by the time Pac-Man had reached shelves, he said he was deep into work on the Sword Quest series, where he has described himself as the creative force behind the project, ultimately writing Fireworld, the second of the planned 4-part series of VCS games, and starting work on the unreleased Airworld, which would have concluded it. With the benefit of hindsight on Pac-Man, however, Frye told Goldberg and Vendel that he probably would have matched up the colors used in the arcade instead of changing them. In a 2018 interview with the Arcade Attack Retro Gaming podcast, Frye mentioned that he had developed a technique that would have minimized flicker usage in Pac-Man, only flickering graphics when more than 2 characters were on the same line, but ultimately decided that it would have been harder to implement. At the time of the interview, he felt like it would have been worth the extra month of effort to reduce the flickering that permeates his game. Outside of that, however, Frye has said that he was happy with how the VCS version of Pac-Man turned out, and is adamant that keeping the 2-player mode was a fair trade-off. It does seem likely that Pac-Man is effectively the line in the sand for VCS coin-op conversions. Of Atari's other 2 coin-op conversions that came out afterwards, Defender and Berserk, Defender, in development concurrent with Pac-Man, is the only one that really takes liberties with the core concept of the arcade game, albeit in a way that still seemingly satisfied players. Gerard C.'s remarks indicate that Atari had refocused on coin-op conversions for 1983, and much like Berserk, all of these much more closely resemble their arcade predecessors than something like Pac-Man. It's very possible, though speculative, that the critical reception to Pac-Man increased competition from third parties and more capable systems like the ColecoVision, and with 8K cartridges now being available for developers, that Atari's developers felt more pressure to be as accurate as possible to the originals. Almost all of these were developed by the remarkable teams at General Computer Corporation, Ms. Pac-Man, Galaxy, and Jungle Hunt and Centipede, for example. But even those that weren't, like Gravatar and Mario Brothers, are still magnificent feats for the hardware. Even if Pac-Man wasn't the catalyst for this change, it's still the demarcation point for the end of developers doing their own thing with coin-op conversions until the NES era. Whether or not that's a good thing, in this case, depends on how much you like Tod Frye's weird little take on the muncher genre. Next time, we storm some barns.